Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining Woodburn and Accountants and Advisors China webinar series on human resource compliance in China. Today is part one, where we'll be looking at the critical Chinese labor and employment law questions. Now, obviously, I can't do a webinar series on human resource compliance without talking about what is currently happening in China, which everybody knows is around the coronavirus. So I will be touching on the coronavirus, how it's impacting life from a personal perspective, an employee perspective, as well as from a business perspective. And then I will be going back to the original presentation I had planned prior to all of this happening, which will be looking at the critical labor and employment law questions that people do have to think about. So, the biggest questions that arise are, can you hire in China without a legal presence? What are the critical labor and employment law questions for us to know? Is it difficult to terminate employees in China? How can you prevent fraud occurring amongst your employees? Do you know about the visa requirements? Are you familiar with individual income tax requirements? Do you know about the mandatory social insurance requirements? This is the whole purpose of today's or this week's workshop series on human resource compliance in China. And obviously, there will be a spin on all of these topics in relation to what's happening right now regarding the coronavirus. So my goal is that for those of you that are just joining today's presentation, or for those of you that have signed up for all 4 of the presentations this week, I'm really hoping that you'll get a proper, practical overview of what is happening right now, as well as what you need to do if you're not in China yet and you're exploring the market and you need to understand everything regarding these labor issues. So welcome to part 1 of the webinar series, which is on the critical Chinese labor and employment law questions. So I really am trying in 2020 to get you guys to be much more interactive with me. So I do want to encourage you all to insert your answers to questions that I'm going to start raising into the chat section, as well as into the question section of the control panel. So who is this webinar for? Well, this webinar, I customized it and separated into 3 categories. I would love to know if you're a newbie, if you're a startup in China, or if you're an experienced China hand. I'll explain what those are, but please do insert those into the chat section of the control panel. Basically, what I define as a newbie in China, it's somebody who has found an opportunity, or it's an entrepreneur who's looking to get themselves set up in China, or it's a company that has received an inquiry randomly from someone in China, even though they've never considered China as a market, and they're looking to educate themselves on how to develop this business, how to transact with China, maybe how to even implement in China, and how to ultimately protect their business in all different aspects, whether it's from IP protection all the way to transactional protection in terms of contracts, taxes, etc. The next are the startups in China. So for me, those are individuals or companies that have been established in China for about 1 to 3 years. I can even expand on that, maybe 1 to 5 years. And they've been placing for that period so much of their attention and focus on the core business, predominantly probably sales, that they've left out a lot of compliance oriented issues, and they're needing to fix certain things up. And this pretty much happens to everybody that gets set up in China. And then obviously the experienced China hands are those that have had maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years of experience in China. You would assume that they know everything, but obviously rules and regulations change expediently in China. I mean, we can already see with the coronavirus, we are getting updates daily based on city, based on province, that people just need to be informed. They have to maintain their knowledge level, and so they're always, the experienced China hands, they're always looking for new, fresh ideas, looking for the latest updates, and just to learn from other people. So this is why I do encourage you to interact. If you can, interact with me. Give me your comments so that we can also share with each other. So if you'd be so kind, take a couple of seconds, insert into the chat section. Are you a newbie? Are you a startup? Or are you experienced China hand? This gets me to really know who you are and what your background is. The next is, how does this webinar work? Well, you've all signed up onto the GoToWebinar system. If you are in jurisdictions which are a bit information sensitive, like China, like the Middle East, you may find that you have to use a VPN to properly log on to the GoToWebinar system or switch to a landline. So if you go to the audio section, you have the ability to choose between a landline or your computer audio. You're all muted. This is obviously to avoid any background noise during today's presentation, but this is why I encourage you, use the chat section, use the question section, interact with me. Let's get this a bit more exciting. Grab yourselves a pen and paper. I mean, there will be a copy of the recording on our YouTube channel, and you'll get a copy of the presentation as well. But take notes. I generally do talk quite fast. I apologize for that. But take some notes, grab yourselves a pen and paper, and don't forget, you can always reach out to me at the end. This is 60 minutes for you. This is 60 minutes of information that I'm going to provide to you. You know, make it useful for you. This is your time that you're spending with me. So, you know, interact, ask questions. I might not be able to get to everyone today, but I'll do my very best to do that. And if not, I'll reach out to you personally to answer any questions you might have. So what is the agenda for today? What are we covering? I am going to be covering about the current situation in China regarding the coronavirus. I'm going to be taking a look at my own personal reflection on it and tell you just as a person what my family and I are dealing with. I'm also going to take a look at what my employees are dealing with, and then as well as business side. I can only reflect the business side on my own business and tell you what obstacles we're incurring, but it might give you an idea of what's actually happening on the ground in China. And then, you know, you can relate that maybe a little bit more to your business. And then I'm going to be looking at 9 critical issues regarding China labor and employment law. So why am I able to help you on these issues? Well, frankly, I'm not currently on the ground in China. I was there over Chinese New Year period. I had to make a personal decision to leave with my kids. But I have been 16 years in Shanghai. My experience is in corporate services and compliance. I've helped over 500 international companies with their market strategy, market entry, market implementation, and growth in China. I'm also the creator of our China Roadmap program, which if you are a newbie in China, as well as if you are a startup, it's something that could be very useful to you to utilize as a roadmap for your own China journey. And I'll be touching on that a little bit within the conclusion. If you enjoy our webinar series, if you like our newsletters, which go out about 3 times a week, it's always about different articles, publications, webinars we've done, upcoming events. You can subscribe free of charge on our website. It's free complimentary information. Otherwise, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I've been posting a lot of updates lately about the coronavirus myself. You can just follow me, follow our company page, or you can also subscribe to our Woodburn YouTube channel, where we've got all of our past webinars as well. So I think the biggest question is, why should you be concerned by labor issues right now? Well, obviously, the first point I had when I first created this presentation was surrounding fraud, because fraud obviously exists in China. It usually surprises people when it pops up. You know, it's usually when employees do something bad against you, and it happens, right? And it's primarily because you've got high expectations for the market. It's a new culture. You place a lot of trust and loyalty in the first round of employees that you hire. And quite frankly, fraud pretty much happens to everybody at some point in your China journey. So, you know, the whole purpose initially when I created this webinar series was to figure out ways to protect yourself when signing employment contracts or having employee agreements with individuals, and how you could then protect yourself. And obviously now there's a twist to this because we now have the coronavirus. And I don't really think people are so much focused on fraud. I think it's a totally other issue right now, which I'll be focusing on as well. So let's look a little bit at the coronavirus. And I just want to give a bit of a personal reflection in terms of my own life, because quite frankly, I've been listening to a lot of webinars, all issued by the various chambers of commerce. I mean, almost daily, you will find a webinar now that's organized either by the German chamber, French chamber, Spanish chamber, British, Australian, American, Swiss. I mean, everyone is pumping out webinars about what is happening and the impact of your business and what's going on in China. What everyone is doing from my perspective is looking at the policies that have been written. Now, quite frankly, if you have a company in China, you should be contacting either your general manager or you should be contacting your corporate service provider and saying, what is the individual impact for me? Okay, stop looking at the generalizations, okay, because you're going to be reading policies that are coming out daily. There'll be certain things that are specific to a city, specific to a province. There are differentiations right now based on, you know, what individual cities and provinces are seeing and how the coronavirus is impacting their people, their citizens. So wherever your company is based, don't look at the overall policies that are being generated. If you're based in Shanghai, again, contact your GM or reach out to a corporate service provider or reach out to a lawyer. Everybody is pumping out information that is so generalistic that you need to know what is happening to your own company. Okay, that's the biggest tip I can give you today. All right, find out what you need to know for your specific company, because it is so confusing right now to read everything that's popping out. Every chamber is popping something out. Legal, you know, lawyers are pumping out articles left, right, and center. It's all very macroeconomic. You've got to look specifically at your company and what's going to happen. So if you haven't done that already, reach out to whomever you're working with and find out about your own individual circumstance. All right. Now I'm going to touch on the personal reflection side of this, which is just my own family, because I think we have to look at the human side of things and how people are making decisions locally. So what's happening with us is that we decided to stay in Shanghai over Chinese New Year. We've been away for Christmas and New Year. We stayed. Coronavirus popped out. We quarantined ourselves at home because we've got two very, very young kids, 3 and 5. I came back from university. When I graduated university, I came back to Hong Kong and there was SARS. So I was very familiar with what we needed to do as a family to disinfect our home, and what we needed to do or prevent ourselves from doing in terms of going outside. So basically, you know, what we did is we disinfected the entire home, the entire apartment, disinfected all the toys. I mean, we disinfected absolutely everything. We nicknamed it the spring cleaning, and we used that time to really clean everything out. If we went outside, the minute, I mean, obviously masks were being worn. Kids were not happy to wear the masks, as you can very well imagine. So we actually tried to prevent them from going outside. So it was only my husband or I who would then go outside. Coming back in, basically we would strip. Clothes would go automatically in a washer, and we would shower and disinfect ourselves before doing or touching anything in the house. And it's become our new normal. Now, because of the situation, and predominantly because of the school situation, because schools right now are indefinitely closed, and the rumor is that they won't open until after the May holiday, we had to make a very own personal decision that I would take the children to Europe where I would then put them in school for a certain period of time. So they're in public school at the moment. It's keeping them busy. My kids are still only 3 and 5, so it's a bit like nursery and playtime, but at least they're learning their second language more appropriately, and they're busy. I would have actually preferred to have stayed in Shanghai, but the issue is that our nanny has not been able to come back to Shanghai because of transportation closures. So you can imagine this is affecting everybody. This is not just me. You know, schools are closed. Families have had to make a decision. Do we stay? Do we go? What do we do with the children? Those that have nannies, because both parents are working, a lot of the Chinese nannies are unable to travel back to Shanghai, which is in our case. So that was a personal decision that we had to make. Now, you have to imagine all of, and I'll touch this on with the employees, but now my husband has stayed primarily because he's part of the crisis management team within his organization. He's one of 4 expatriates that has had to remain to deal with the crisis management that's occurring right now. And for him, it's just, I don't want to say it's business as usual, because it's really not business as usual. He's working from home, or the 4 guys meet up in someone's home. Nobody's going to the office, and they're trying to prevent all of these things. And there's a lot of communication that's going on between employees, between lawyers, between a variety of different people, because it's not just looking at the HR side of the business, it's also looking at all the supplier. They also have a production facility in China. It's looking at the whole supply chain and reevaluating what's going to happen next. So it's an extremely busy time for him. So this is pretty much the same with everyone else. I have spent the last 3 weeks talking to all the different contacts at the Chambers of Commerce that I'm a member of, that Woodburn is a member of, talking with the individuals that are based there. Those that have stayed in China, I mean, everyone has cabin fever. Okay, there's a serious mental capacity that is, everyone's suffering a little bit, which is why you see e-commerce numbers skyrocketing through the roof, and gaming apps and, you know, online streaming is booming because people are stuck at home. That's basically the personal reflection. So, you know, from a personal perspective, from a family perspective, we're a bit stuck. We found a solution. I have a lot of friends where either one of the spouses has had to leave to bring the children out. Those that have older children, they're doing online classes that the schools are being offered. So they have homework every day. Mine are too young to have that, unfortunately. I wish they did, which is why I enrolled them into a public school. But that's sort of the situation that's happening on a personal level. So a lot of individuals in Shanghai and in China in general have had to make personal decisions about what to do with their own family life, okay? And I would say probably 95% have taken their children out of China. So you will always find that one spouse is left, which basically means that either they're working remotely, or they've resigned from their positions, or something to that effect. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening from an individual perspective, and I'm talking about as an expatriate. Then you've got to think about the employee perspectives, and again, I'm only going to relate this to my own team. There are many people that canceled their Chinese New Year holidays because the coronavirus had just started, so many of them stayed in Shanghai. Which I think ultimately they were better off doing, primarily because once the offices did open on February 10th, they were able to go to the office and kind of leave the house. Everybody's wearing masks on the streets. The biggest dilemma people are facing, and I see that just with our own office building, we're in a building called the Hong Kong New World Tower. The nickname is K11. Whenever you enter the building, there are temperature control. They take your temperature, they check if you're wearing your mask, they see how you're dressed, and if they don't agree, the building won't let you in. If they do agree, the building will let you in. So that's kind of the situation. You know, so you know, those that stayed in Shanghai are able to go to the office. Those that didn't stay in Shanghai, as they've been coming back to Shanghai, well, I'm sort of pushing it, but there's also the government incentive, which is saying, please stay at home for a period of 14 days before you leave the house and go to the office or go anywhere. So for those of my team that were that were vacationing somewhere else, whether that was in China or outside of China, they have all come back and they've been in quarantine for 14 days. And hopefully by 1st of March, my whole team will be back in the office. Now, my dilemma is the following. Not every single staff member has a laptop, which probably will be something now that I change. But I do have quite a few members of staff that just have desktops that are sitting in the office and they are unable to get to them. Those that do have laptops, some of them didn't even take them on their vacation. Chinese New Year is a very big vacation for families, so they haven't been able to even get their own laptops. So, you know, it's a very tricky situation for everyone. So as you can imagine, I'm not fully staffed. And as you can probably imagine, most companies are not fully staffed. Everyone is sort of juggling the situation on who's got their laptop, who's still in quarantine, and who's able to go to the office. For those that are a little bit more flexible, they're even doing rotations so that people don't go all to the office. It's maybe, you know, you'll have 3 or 4 staff that go to the office and then they'll rotate, and the next day another set of 3 or 4 will go. Everyone's kind of spreading it out. But it really also does come down to the building that you're in, which I think is something that's also quite critical to know what your building's policy is in relation to the coronavirus and what they're following as guidelines. All restaurants in our building are shut. So, and most restaurants, we're on Huahai Lu, near Xintiandi. Most of the restaurants are not open. Many of the bigger brands that offer delivery services are open, but the smaller ones have kind of all shut down. Again, making it not very easy to just get some amenities. The biggest issue that I have is I do have a good portion of my employees that are women, that have families and children, where they simply can't even come to the office because they have to do childcare. Because again, even for them, if they do have IEs or nannies, they are unable to come back to Shanghai, and so they have to stay at home with their children. So again, for me, currently, my biggest obstacle is childcare. Even if I wanted to get some of my staff in the office, you know, they would have to discuss with their spouses to coordinate and rotate in order for someone to be at home with the children. So a lot of these things are things that just happen, you know, very spontaneously, right? I mean, the coronavirus, it was announced, people were already on holiday. Not everyone took their laptops. No, not a lot of people took their equipment with them. And then the issue, of course, is that most of the nannies and IEs left Shanghai to go home, and it's very difficult for them to come back right now. So there's a lot of complexity just from a family perspective in relation to a lot of the employees that are out. I hope I'm giving you guys a sense of what's happening on the ground, because you know, you can read all the policy guidelines and all of that, but this is what's happening really at people's homes. Okay. People aren't going to supermarkets. There's now online groceries where you can order your groceries online. That's what we're doing as well personally, or we're ordering food to come to us, and you know, we're basically living out of our homes, and living, working, and breathing out of our homes. And the biggest dilemma right now is cabin fever. From a business impact, again, I'm going to give it to you in relation to what's happening with us, because that's all I can really relate to right now. So the difficulty we have is that nobody wants to have meetings with us face to face, obviously, and primarily also because there are not a lot of people in the offices. So you've got to imagine that this relates to government bureaus, where we do a lot of work in terms of companies and corporations, as well as in terms of any changes of licenses, So AIC, MOFCOM, COC, I mean, you can only get people on the phone, and the waiting list on the phone is lengthy because not everyone is in the office. Then you got the tax bureaus, where again, they're on rotation and half-staffed. So to get any information about the tax bureaus is also a bit of a nightmare. Banks are also half-staffed, and you need to make appointments where it's pretty much a nightmare to make an appointment and meet anyone at the banks. So you got to think about this. These are the organizations we work with predominantly, right? So it's the government offices, tax bureaus, banks, labor bureaus, the entry and exit administration bureau. You know, everyone has been very helpful, very kind. It just is a little bit frustrating when you need some information quick because the client is requesting it. So whoever you are online today, just be wary. You know, it is frustrating times for everybody right now. All right, to get any form of information that's specific to you, it's going to take time. One of the most amazing things that I think popped up from the tax bureau is that they really don't want to meet you. So I don't know if you all know this, but fapiaos, which are the official invoices in China, these are very delicate pieces of documents. You can order it online now and get it couriered to you. I have never heard of the tax bureau ever doing this. Okay, so I mean, the fact that they're willing to courier these fapiaos, which could easily be lost in the courier or stolen, they're going to take these risks now to do all of this online. And I'm hoping, for example, that will continue. I'm hoping that will be a transformation that will continue even after the coronavirus, but we'll see. But you know, there's a lot of changes and updates, and Shanghai actually just published that with all of this that's occurring in the coronavirus, they're realizing that a lot of things should be done online. A lot of applications, a lot of excuse me, bureaucratic, administrative applications should all be done online. So I'm hoping that this will be a great push towards moving that all online. Just very simply, I think to explain a little bit the dilemmas we have in our office building is that, and it's very contradictory, but the local EMS, so the local courier providers, they have free access into the building. I don't want to say it's free access. I mean that they have a little bit more liberty to move within our office building. Any of the foreign couriers, DHL, FedEx, anywhere where it's been an international package coming in, our office building does not allow their entry, and as a consequence, we've got to meet them at a dispatch pickup point with ID, powers of attorney, and whatnot to pick up the packages. So it is much more complicated, just from a basic, simple business processing to get things done. So, you know, I'm hoping people understand a little bit just the slight, you know, issues we're having. In terms of communication, in terms of availability by government bureaus, banks, tax bureaus. It's just not easy times right now. So obviously, the current challenges for companies is staff shortage. For those of you that have the majority of your supply chain in China, I mean, if you're producing in China, there's probably factories that are still shut down. Yes, there are still factories that are still shut down. Factories are slowly opening up as individuals are allowed to get out of quarantine. It obviously means, though, that, you know, you can't, any part of your supply chain is going to be halted, okay, because there is a lack of staff shortage, a lack of materials, because you don't have people to drive trucks, drive trains. Logistics is also halted. And then obviously one of the biggest spiels right now through all the lawyers is in regards to the force majeure clause in contracts. You know, who's at fault with whom, and there's a lot of negotiations behind it. I mean, you can read all of these legal documents, legal articles that are being published by all the law firms about this, but ultimately you should be analyzing your contracts to look at the force majeure clauses to see whether you want to exit these contracts or just deal with the current situation and continue with these contracts. So I just want to highlight a couple of safety measures, and practical solutions. Definitely think about having, for an extended period of time, a home office for your employees. Even when they are able to leave the quarantine period, I encourage you to think about home office solutions just from a family perspective, because they can't leave their children. If they have families and children, they can't leave them. So think about instilling a home office. Once they are able to leave their homes, ask them to pick up their laptops and try to organize a schedule where they can work from home versus going to the office and going to the office building. If you are a larger organization, definitely think about developing a crisis team, particularly if a good portion and chunk of your business is China, if it's all the way from production, logistics, sales, etc. You might want to have your CFO, CEO, COO, all within the crisis team, HR as well, getting involved to figure out how to mitigate the crisis. You should definitely have a hotline for employees, and I say this for larger organizations. If you're a smaller organization, please, I implore with you, get on the phone every day with your staff. They're alone out there. You might have very high expectations of them. Just communicate. That's all they want, just communication. Ask them through WeChat, how are you? How's your family? Are you okay? When do you think you could go to the office? Let's talk about how we're going to manage the next steps. Keep open the communication lines. Okay, that's all your staff want. Don't isolate them. Don't ignore them. Okay, they're alone out there. All right. I feel guilty on a daily basis that I'm out in Europe because I'm not with my team. But I can tell you right now, I am at least for an hour to 2 hours with a variety of different team members every day, just to keep them secure, to increase morale, keep them knowing that I care, that we're going to get through this, that it's all going to be okay, to encourage them to get in touch with the clients and have communication with the clients on a daily basis. You have to be a leader and guide them. All right, they're already lost from a personal perspective, not knowing what to do, how to handle their families, their wives, their children. Guide them in regards to the company aspects. Okay, I implore you to do that. Ask them daily for their health status. The other day, I had one of my team members tell me, I was asking her where was she. She said, "Oh, I just left the house because I've got to go to the hospital to get something for my father." And I panicked. I said, "What do you mean you're going to the hospital?" She said, "No, I just have to update his medication. So I'm just going to the hospital, getting his prescription renewed, and then I'm taking back." Don't worry. I was the one panicking. But ask them about their health status. Is everyone okay? Are the parents okay? Is everyone fine? Self-quarantine, if they have passed the government regulation deadlines of 14 days at home, really think about business travel. Now, I actually had a call the other week with a client who has a staff who has a Chinese passport, which says she is from Hebei, from Wuhan. She was vacationing in New Zealand, and she was going from New Zealand anyhow to the UK for 2 months training. And there was absolutely no way for her to get to the UK from New Zealand. Nobody was willing to have her on any stopover. Bangkok was the only city in the end that allowed her to do a stopover. So if you have staff members that are overseas, that are, understand their traveling patterns, understand where they are, how are they going to get home? If you don't want them to go home and you want to work from your headquarters, how are you going to get them to your headquarters? Understand all the quarantine aspects from that regard. But don't enforce any form of business travel that's absolutely not necessary, where ultimately you could do a video conferencing and eliminate that travel purpose. You've got to establish communications with everyone, not just your employees. Establish it with your suppliers, establish it with customers, establish it with third-party vendors, establish open communications. Talk to as many people as you can to understand what are the current situations, okay? I've been spending 3 weeks just doing that, talking to everyone that I work with to understand what their current situation is and how we can continue working or not continue working together, okay? The next, obviously, is the most critical, and I'm under the assumption that most of you have already done this. If not, you should think about doing this. You've got to review your 2020 budgets and business plans. You definitely have to review your Q1 budgets. Everyone seems to be quite optimistic about things starting up again from March 1st. I know from us talking to potential investors into China, you know, they're going to halt business until they know they themselves can travel to China to ensue the business. So it could very well be that Q1, Q2 are actually halted and impact your operations. So be wary of this, right? And think about different scenarios when creating your budgets. That might help you a lot in going on the next steps. But one thing I can't emphasize more is just having an open dialogue with everyone you work with in China. You know, I was going to start off this presentation talking about fraud, which obviously I'm not. I'm talking about having open dialogue and communication and support and being kind to all of your employees, suppliers, customers, and vendors, because that is critical. You know, it's all about relationship in China, and people are going to remember who followed up and checked on them. Okay, so think about having that dialogue. And I'm going to put this slide out there. Really, be kind, be supportive, be in touch with your team, be in touch with customers, be in touch with suppliers. Okay, just over this weekend or yesterday, all over the news is also about how Italy is now affected by the coronavirus, how schools have also been shut in Italy due to the coronavirus. You know, I mean, it's affecting now people in other locations just besides China. So let's be kind, let's be supportive, let's find new ways of communication, whether that be through webinars, whether that be through video conferencing solutions, telephone calls, WeChat. There's so many options available to keep the communication open. So I'm a little bit depressed talking about the coronavirus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what was the real point of this webinar session. Again, if you do have, I mean, I don't want to laugh about it, but if you do have questions about your specific situation, your employees, your business impact, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to try and answer all of your questions. I say try because there's still so many gray areas out there about what is applicable to whom in terms of the policies, but don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions. So the purpose of today's presentation was really to look at 9 critical issues regarding the Chinese labor and employment law. So I do want to get back to business and talk about these 9 issues. And I'll start with the first one, which a lot of people ask me about, which is, can you hire in China without a legal presence? The reason why I want to start off with this question is because it's really for the newbies that are on today's presentation who are looking to invest into China, and they're probably looking for the cheapest solution available to them. So usually what they do is they hire someone on the ground through a freelance agreement, through terms and conditions that have been validated over email correspondence with no formal agreement, etc. Ultimately, I just want to emphasize here, it is not allowed for you to hire in China without a legal presence, okay? Companies must have a local, legal, corporate presence within China to engage with employees. Only registered organizations that can independently be held liable, such as enterprises, individual economic entities, private non-enterprise organizations, they can hire directly employees in China. So the best practice, obviously, if you want to hire someone on the ground, is to set up a subsidiary, a branch, or even a representative office. Otherwise, you can also utilize intermediaries that can help you to hire these individuals for a temporary basis until you are sure and ready to establish your entity in China. So some companies do hire other types of workers in China without establishing a presence. And again, that can be through suppliers, or it can be through customers or other types of vendors. And this approach has given, will give rise to its own issues that you really need to understand before getting into those situations. So if you do, or you are thinking about that, or you are doing that currently, definitely talk to somebody about how to make sure you're completely bulletproof with that type of arrangement. Okay, you want to make sure you are completely protected. The second critical issue is a written employment contract required, and is an electronic version of the contract permissible? So yes, a written employment contract is absolutely required in China. If the parties don't execute a written contract, then after 1 year, the employer and the employee are deemed to have established a non-fixed term, i.e. a permanent employment relationship. This is not the wisest approach, however. Failure to create any written employment contract can subject the employer to severe penalties, for example, payment of double of the employee's monthly salary, whether it is the employer or the employee's fault. And although it is commonplace for many employment documents to be created and stored electronically, Chinese courts still prefer the originals, the hard copies, to see the actual signatures and chops on the agreements. So it is important that although you might have electronic versions, you should still always have an original hard copy version with the real chops and signatures on them to be utilized in case of any breach of contract, or if you do want to go to labor arbitration committees. The third is, so these are really the top 3 questions that I always get asked. The third is, how difficult is it to terminate an employee in China? It is extremely difficult because the Chinese law is really highly protective of employees. Unilateral termination is very challenging and must be based on cause, which are specified in the employment laws. These causes can include poor performance, but even that is subject to significant limitations. It can include gross misconduct, long-term sick leave, criminal conviction, organizational changes, or restructuring. But really, it's not easy. Even if termination is based on any one of these causes, the employers need to follow a certain procedure and produce substantial evidence to justify the termination. And usually that evidence should be some form of written proof. And the penalty for any wrongful termination is payment of damages or a reinstatement. Mutual terminations are obviously something that should be common. It should be something you strive for so that you don't run into any difficulties. Before you decide to do any form of termination, you should really think about what type of compensation is going to be owed to the employee, so you're aware of the total cost that is going to affect you when you do terminate. The next question is, a fixed term employment contract permissible? Yes, it is. There are some jurisdictions around the world that are not, that frown upon fixed term agreements, but in China, they are actually quite common. The issue in China, however, is that you can only sign 2 fixed term employment contracts. Apologies. You can only sign 2 fixed employment contracts, and then you have to move on to an indefinite, an indefinite open-ended contract. Usually, what most people do is they sign open-ended contracts from the get-go, because the termination clauses are the same whether they're fixed term or open-ended. The next one is whether an employee handbook is required. Now, this is where I always get into very difficult discussions with my clients about whether they need a handbook. They're all knowing now and very aware that at least the employment contract is required. In regards to the employee handbook, it's not technically required. There's no government which is saying that you have to sign a handbook, but it is so strongly recommended. And the reason why it's recommended, because the employee handbook is basically the employee operational guidelines that the employee has to follow when they're working with you. So what does that actually mean? It means that there are going to be terms and conditions in the handbook about how much holiday leave they can take, what are the regulations on maternity leave, on parental leave, on, you know, a variety of different things. But then in addition to that, you are going to have clauses about how to terminate someone. So for example, how to give warning letters, right? Usually the rule of thumb is that you give 3 warning letters and then the person can be terminated. This is written proof that you have the ability to terminate someone. So the employee handbook will have clauses within it saying, you know, how they define a, I don't know, a type of warning A, how they define a type of warning B, how they define a type of warning C, which is C is the worst, A is kind of not great, but you know, you'll get by and be disciplined lightly. But you have to be aware that this employee handbook is a guide for you to be able to terminate someone. And it makes things a lot easier. But on the side of the employee, it gives so much transparency to what the employee is allowed to do and what the employee is not allowed to do. So definitely think about having an employee handbook as well. What my clients usually say is, oh, Christina, you know, we're so small, we don't want to pay for having an employee handbook drafted and reviewed, and we don't want to spend time on this right now. We only have 1 staff. So, I mean, it's going to be so easy to control them and monitor them, you know, and then very quickly the China business grows and suddenly they have 10 staff in their office and still no employee handbook and no operational guideline on how to operate them. So, you know, really think very carefully about having these types of employee handbooks. The 6th question is looking at the employment law itself, and does it differ from province to province? This is actually the problem. Yes, it does. So there is actually one national employment law in China. However, when you're looking at larger provinces, you will find that they have their own legislative powers and their own definitions to certain clauses that are within the national employment law. So there are regional and provincial differentiations between that one national employment law. In addition to that, you will also find that labor arbitration tribunals and courts are more sophisticated in, for example, the tier 1 cities versus in the tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 cities. So you just need to be aware of what, you know, the local laws are telling you about employment and how it can affect your business. The next big question is, how do employment matters impact transactions? And by transactions, I'm referring to mergers and acquisitions. Or, for example, you have set up in China with a representative office, and after 5-6 years, you decide to actually move on to a limited liability company and close down that rep office. Now, in your mind, you're probably thinking, wow, that's just a transfer of staff. I don't actually have to do anything. Wrong. You need to have your employees resign, or you need to terminate them from the representative office and sign brand new contracts, which ultimately might lead to brand new terms and conditions under the limited liability company. So it is very important to understand how that's going to affect your business. Will the employees use that as an opportunity to negotiate with you on new terms and conditions, new salary levels, new bonus levels, new commissions, etc. So it's very important to have open dialogue and open communication with the employees if you're doing a merger and acquisition, or you're trying to do an internal transfer between, you know, 2 different or 3 different entities, to make sure that there's a mutual agreement that the terms and conditions remain the same. Now, for a lot of employees, what will impact them the most with these types of transactions is their social insurance. So the longer, if there's any form of break in their employment, they won't get their social insurance continued. So, you know, you have to always justify within the new contracts that they've been actually employee of the group for a period, you have to give the date of first employment so that their social insurances actually continue. This impacts their retirement fund, etc. So these are critical things to think about. Number 8 is, are there other hiring alternatives besides direct employment? So there are. To reduce labor costs or to increase flexibility, however way you want to look at it, many companies often prefer outsourcing, so using an intermediary, because then they don't have to set up an entity and they're using the intermediary to do the full legal employment, or they're going to engage certain workers or employees through a labor dispatch agency. Although it is permissible to hire people as dispatched workers, so through the labor dispatch agency, they can only be brought on as temporary, auxiliary, or subsidiary employees, so not full-time. Part-time employment is another option. Unlike full-time employees, part-time employees who work no more than 4 hours per day, 24 hours per week, they're not entitled to certain minimum rights, such as a written employment agreement, overtime pay, vacation, or other types of paid leave. In contrast, an independent contractor relationship is generally not recognized in China. So another word for independent contractor relationship would be a freelance agreement, which is why it's extremely important to know how this freelance agreement is going to be worked out and how you're defining the terms and conditions within that agreement. So usually we would recommend, if you want to stick with a freelance agreement, that your employees set up their own entity in China so that at least they can invoice you for services rendered and issue you a fapiao, a proper invoice. Because otherwise, if it's just overseas company with individual, it makes it very, very tricky to defend that. And ultimately, it's really not recognized in China. Question 9 might not actually impact a lot of you, but it is something I did want to touch on as point 9, as companies tend to grow in China. So the question is a non-unionized foreign company affected by the local labor, excuse me, let me say that all over again. Is a non-unionized foreign company affected by the local labor unions? And the answer to that is yes. So trade unions can actually influence a non-unionized workforce due to their dual roles representing the interests of both the state and the labor. For example, an employer that unilaterally terminates an employee, they need to notify the company's union, even if the employee is not a union member. So generally speaking, unions can be formed if you have a staff of 25 plus. Okay, that's not much. Now, most people aren't aware of that. But if you do have employees who start raising that question, that they want a trade union, you have to be aware that it does start at 25 employees and over. In recent years, the local union has actively encouraged foreign companies to establish in-house company unions. And if such unions are established, the company is also required to pay union dues, which are about 2% of the total payroll. And again, that's whether or not the employees are union members. So you need to be aware of that if you're, if you're at the 25 plus employee range. So we've looked at the various 9 points. I just want to highlight 4 ways you can work with me if you are interested in working with me in order to get protected. The one is just generally employment advisory. We also help to draft employment agreements and handbooks. We also can do employee due diligences. And we also offer what is called an incubation service, where we can also act as an intermediary to hire individuals on the ground on your behalf. In relation to the coronavirus, you can also reach out to me if you have any questions regarding to your specific situation, whether that's from a personal perspective, employee perspective, company perspective. I'm just also going to throw it out there, even if you just want to chat about it. There are a lot of people that probably haven't spoken to individuals for quite some time, being that they've been stuck home for 3 weeks. Even if you just want to talk, I'm being kind here. Reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you and just talk about what's going on in the market right now. If you're interested in chatting with me, you can set up a meeting directly in my diary. I'm going to include the link here into the chat box. You guys haven't been really chatting with me. I'm sad, but I'm going to put the link here. I'm happy to have a one-on-one with you to book a strategy session and to talk over what's happening at the moment, or to talk about your own very specific situations about China labor and China employment issues. I highlighted in the introduction about the China roadmap. I think this is something that is very, very useful for everybody that is set up in China. So I do just want to highlight what the China roadmap is. We have devised a China roadmap for basically companies that are looking to grasp at a China opportunity, implement a compliant and safe structure, and then grow exponentially in the market. And what we've done is that we've created these milestones and strategies which we feel can be unified across the board for any company. So what that basically means is that milestone 1 is understanding your opportunity. It's getting educated, it's compiling research, a variety of different research, whether that is focus groups, market segmentation. There's thousands of different research you could do. And then developing a strategy and a budget. So developing a strategy, creating a business plan, and having a budget for that business. Now, this roadmap is in relation to not people that are necessarily looking to implement in China. This is anyone that is looking to also just transact with China, right? Even if you want to transact with China, you've got to educate yourself. You've got to do your research. You've got to create a strategy to know exactly what you're going to do in these transactions, okay? Then comes the implementation aspect, which is all about creating an ecosystem, a network of partners, whether that's clients, suppliers, vendors, third-party providers, employees, etc. You've got to protect yourself, not just within your trademark and copyright and patent, but also protect yourself with contract development, optimizing your taxes all around those contracts, etc., and then developing operational guidelines. So having an employee handbook is within that system processes part. Okay, it's developing operational guidelines in terms of so that actually anybody in your company knows exactly how they should be doing their business in China. And if you have a lot of staff rotation, any of the new employees will know exactly how to follow those guidelines because you have written system processes in place. Once that's all done, you move on to the third milestone, which is growth, okay? Now, you can't imagine the number of companies that don't do this. You've got to look at your China numbers, all right? You've got to be able to read your P&Ls. You've got to be able to read your balance sheets and understand where your standing is today. And then you've got to analyze those. So you've got to be able to interpret them and then be able to come out with certain conclusions that give you then direction of what your focus should be on next. Okay, so it's a whole flow of, basically putting you on the right roadmap to get successful into China. Okay, and making sure that you don't miss out on anything. So that's our China roadmap. If you are a newbie, you might be interested in our mentorship program, which brings you all along this roadmap. I also help this out with certain startups. But if you're interested in learning more about it, let me know. Otherwise, we're now at the Q&A part. So there's one question that did come in. Thank you, John. You interacted with me. I appreciate it. There's a question from John. How do you manage mass provision for employees starting to return to the office? So that's a very big question. The majority of my staff actually stayed in Shanghai over the holidays, so they had their own collection of masks readily available. My parents reside in Hong Kong, and they've decided to stay in Hong Kong. So as a family, they brought masks over to us. Alternatively, reach out to your chambers of commerce and ask them, because they are having a lot of their members donate and also transport masks to China. Another thing that you could easily do is ask friends that are living abroad or family members that are living abroad to buy masks and to courier them over to your employees individually to their home residential addresses. This is something that I'm starting to do now for my own team. But there are a lot of resources out there. So, chambers of commerce, they'll definitely find ways for you to find the masks and to give them to your team. And otherwise, I would extend it out to friends and family that are living abroad if they can buy boxes and send them to you. If you're based in Shanghai, send them to you or send them to your team individually. That was the only question that came in. Oh, John, I appreciate you asking. Oh, there's another question that just popped in from Shui Wei Bai. If employees working from home and work overtime to midnight, is it still considered as overtime to ask for payment or time in lieu? So this is now where it's getting very tricky. If you have employees that are working from home, would they have worked, I'm just going to ask you, Shui Wei, would they have worked till midnight in the office for that project? And then a more interesting question is, what time did they start working at home? Because I can guarantee you, probably a lot of them are only starting to work at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. and then they're working till midnight. I think you've got to have a little bit of faith in terms of what your staff are doing. Are they, obviously, because they are not in the office? So Shui Wei, you mentioned that you do have staff that work until midnight in the office sometimes. So in that situation, what do you do? I assume you either pay for overtime or you do time in lieu, either or. It would be the same if they're working from home. Okay, the biggest question though, obviously, is do you trust that they're working until midnight? Is there some form of proof that they can provide you that they're working until midnight? What do you do in those situations? This is sort of, you have to kind of create your own internal policy on that. And make sure that your employee agrees with you and not that you start getting into a fight over this. I think the priority everyone should be thinking about is getting the job done and how are we going to get the job done, okay? For me, I'm finding it very difficult to get certain jobs done because I'm working from home and I'm not in my office and I don't have all my files next to me and I don't have everything with me, okay? It's difficult. So you've got to have a balance there. John's asking another question. Can you put employees on part-time pay or work basis in the event of prolonged business slump? Absolutely. But again, that is in relation to a mutual discussion you have to have with the employee. And then the question is, will the employee agree to it or not? All right. So obviously, if your business is in a slump and you can't afford to pay people full-time salaries, and if your staff are not even working full-time, you do have a right to put them onto part-time pay. The question is, not the question, the issue is that you need to have a discussion with them, and you have to make sure there's a mutual agreement there, okay? Because again, termination will probably be difficult. You have to show, that you would have to show financial figures to show that you are in a business slump. All right. I've been getting questions about people terminating their staff. It's only been 3 weeks. If you're going to terminate staff now because of the coronavirus, I mean, that's pushing it a little bit, and your staff have every right to go to the labor arbitration committee and say, I'm being terminated for the wrong reasons. So, you have to give valid reasons on that. John, Shui Wei, did I answer your questions? Do you have anything you want to add on? If you have anything you want to add on there, just let me know. All right, perfect. For those of you, everyone else has been silent. I appreciate you two for speaking up and interacting. Again, if you want to reach out to me, go ahead, and the link is in the chat section of your control panel. You can set up an appointment directly into my diary. Otherwise, we're going to be talking tomorrow about, originally when I came up with this series, it was about how to obtain work permits and residence visas. I will be touching on tomorrow about what I've recently learned from the Shanghai Entry and Exit Bureau about current situations of foreigners coming in and out of China, as well as work permit renewals. I know right now there's a lot of issues with teachers because schools are indefinitely closed, and there's a lot of issues regarding whether their visas will be renewed or not. So if you're interested in that, pop on tomorrow's session. We're going to be talking about personal income tax liability on Wednesday, all about the so-called new foreign income tax law. I had touched on that already last year, but I'm going to do that webinar session and also talk about what's happening now since 1 year has passed. And then on Thursday, I'll be talking about social insurance obligations. I put that as a completely separate session because people really don't fully understand what social insurance obligations there are, what they mean, and I want to go into more detail about that on Thursday. So if you are interested in subscribing into any of those 3 sessions, go ahead to woodburnglobal.com/events and you can register there. That is the end of today's session. I appreciate you all coming out for it. I hope I was able to give you a bit of a, getting away from the policies aspect and giving you a more personal perspective on what is happening on the ground in China. Again, if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to have a chat with anyone. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you again in the rest of the days of this week. All the best. Keep safe, keep happy, keep smiling. Goodbye.